Hello, and welcome to ASMR Storytime. going to be reading Chapter 3 of The Red Tent. Chapter 3. Rachel grew quiet. She stopped attending Ina and did not rise from her blanket until Leah shook her and insisted she help the rest of the women in their work. Only then would Rachel spin or weave or work the garden, but wordlessly and without a smile. Jacob could not rouse her from her sadness. Rebuffed by her unbending silence, he stopped calling her to him at night. Her sorrow became a presence so bleak, even the babies began to avoid their pretty aunt. Rachel was alone in her own black night. Bela saw Rachel's despair and went to her where she huddled on her blanket. The little sister lay down beside Rachel and held her as gently as a mother. "Let me go to Jacob on your behalf," said Bela in a whisper. "Let me bear a son on your knees. Let me be your womb and your breast. Let me bleed your blood and shed your tears. Let me become your vessel until your time comes, for your time will yet arrive. Let me be your hope, Rachel. I will not disappoint you." Rachel made no reply. She said nothing for a long time. Bela wondered if her sister had slept through her words or whether her offer had offended. Bela said she waited so long for her to reply that she began to wonder whether the words that had been gathering in her heart had not even passed her lips. Bela was accustomed to the silence and waited. Finally, Rachel turned and kissed her, gathering the small woman close to her body. Taking comfort from her warmth, and the tears she had shed were not bitter or even salty, said Bela, but sweet as rainwater. Bela knew that even though her offer to Rachel was made out of love, it also served her own heart's desire. She understood Rachel's longing because it was her own. She was well into her childbearing years. The sounds of lovemaking in the close world of our tents had roused her at night, leaving her shaken and sleepless. Attending her sister's birth made her wish to become part of the great mother mystery, which is bought with pain and repaid with an infant's sparkling smile and silken skin. Her breast ached to give suck. Honest Bela revealed every corner of her heart to Rachel, who knew the emptiness her sister described. They wept together and slept in each other's arms. The next morning, Rachel sought out Jacob and asked that he sire a child upon Bela in her name. This was not a request, for it was Rachel's right to have a child of Jacob. There was no other permission to seek or get. Jacob agreed. Why would he not? Leah nursed her latest son, and Rachel's back had been turned to him for long months. So this night, on the full moon of a chill month, Bela went to Jacob and left him the next morning, no longer a maiden, though not a bride. There was no henna for Bela's hands, no feast, no gifts. There were no 7 days to learn the secrets of Jacob's body or the meaning of his words. When the sun rose the next day, Jacob returned to oversee the flocks, and Bela went to Rachel and recounted every detail of her night to her sister. Years later, she told it to me. She wept when she entered Jacob's tent, and she was surprised by her own tears. She had wanted to be initiated into the mystery of sex, to open her legs and learn the ancient ways of men and women. But she was lonely, walking into her husband's tent alone, without sisters or ceremony or celebration. She had no right to the rituals of a dowered bride, and yet she missed them. Jacob was kind, Bela remembered. He thought my tears were a sign of fear, so he held me like a child and gave me a woolen bracelet. It was nothing, no precious metal or ivory or anything of value, just a woven braid made for leavings, the kind of thing shepherd boys make absent-mindedly, sitting under a tree in the heat of the day, out of tuft of wool caught on brambles or blown to the ground. Jacob had twirled the brown, black, and cream-colored strands against his thigh until it had enough to plait into a braid. He took the simple thing from his arm and cut it to fit hers. Such a sad little nothing of a bride price, but she wore it throughout for her first year of Jacob's third wife, until it fell apart one day and she lost it without even knowing it was there. Thinking of her bracelet, Bela smiled and with her forefinger traced the place where a bit of string had tied her to Jacob. He comforted me with that poor gift without a word, and I stopped crying. I smiled into his face, and then, I was so bold. I could hardly believe it was me. I put my hand upon his sex and laid his hand upon mine. He lifted my skirt and massaged my belly and my breasts. He buried his face between my thighs, and I almost laughed out loud at the shock of pleasure. When he entered me, it was as though I had fallen into a pool of water. It was as though the moon were singing my name. It was all I hoped for. I slept in Jacob's long arms, cradled like a child for the first time since my mother held me. May her name be set in the stars. For that night alone, I loved Jacob. Bela told all of this to Rachel, It was not easy for my beautiful aunt to hear it, but she insisted that Bila lived nothing out, and the younger sister repeated her story as often as Rachel asked to hear it, until the memory of Bila's consummation became Rachel's own memory, and her sister's pleasure and gratitude became part of her own feelings for Jacob. The day after Jacob knew Bila for the first time, he was called away to do business with a trader in Carchemish, a journey of 2 days. Bila suffered in his absence, for she was eager to lie with him again. Rachel suffered in the knowledge that Jacob had found happiness with Bila. Leah suffered because she felt so distant from her sisters' lives. Zilpah watched it all and said little and sighed much. Upon Jacob's return, he brought Rachel a beaded necklace and spent his first night with her. Leah was still nursing, so he called Bila to him again often during the next months, especially when Rachel was away attending a birth. Jacob and his third wife spoke very little when they were together, but their bodies joined in straightforward postures which yielded them both pleasure and release. Jacob said, I gave him peace, said Bila with a great satisfaction. Bila conceived. Rachel greeted the news with kisses and rejoiced with her sister. As the months passed and her belly grew, Rachel coddled her and asked her to name every sensation, every twinge, every mood. Did Bila know what moment life had taken root? Was the tiredness of pregnancy felt in her knees or in her eyes? Did she crave salt or sweet? The two of them shared a blanket during Bila's pregnancy. The barren woman felt the slow swell of her sister's belly and the gathering heaviness of her breasts. She watched the flesh stretch in tan bands across the brown belly and thighs and noticed the changing colors of her nipples. As the child grew in Bila, draining her of color and energy, Rachel bloomed. She grew soft and round along with Bila, and the hollows that sadness had carved in her cheeks disappeared. She laughed and played with her nephews and the other children of the camp. She baked bread and made cheese without being asked. She lived so deeply inside Bila's pregnancy that during the 9th month, Rachel's ankles grew swollen, and when the time came for the baby to enter the world, Rachel called Ina to be midwife so that she alone could stand behind Bila during her travail and hold her and suffer with her. Happily for Bila, the birth was as simple and quick as the pregnancy had been difficult. After morning's worth of panting and groaning, she stood on the bricks while Rachel crouched around her. Bila's elbows rested on Rachel's splayed knees, and it was as if the two women shared a womb for the awful hour when the baby pushed his way out. Their faces strained and reddened together, and they cried out with single voice when his head appeared. Ina said it was as though a two-headed woman had given birth and declared it one of the strangest things she had ever seen. When the boy was delivered and the cord severed, Rachel held him first, her eyes streaming for a very long time, or so it seemed to Bila, who bit her tongue and waited for the moment she would embrace the first issue of her womb. Bila's eyes followed Rachel's every move as she wiped the blood from the baby's body and checked to see that he was whole and unblemished. Bila barely breathed as the moments passed and her arms remained empty, but she said nothing. By law, the son belonged to Rachel. Years attending so many births had made Rachel's heart tender, and with a great sigh she placed the boy in Bila's arms, where he lifted his eyes to his mother's face and smiled into her eyes before he took her breast. At that instant, Rachel woke from her dream and saw that the baby was not her child. Her smile faded and her shoulders sagged, and her hands clawed at her girlish breast. Ina told Rachel that if she let the baby suck there long enough, he would find milk within her and she could become his milk mother. But Rachel had no faith in her body's ability to sustain life. Putting a child to nurse on an empty breast would cause suffering to her son, who was not hers at all but Bilah's. Besides, Bilah might sicken and even die if she did not empty her breasts, for she had seen that happen. And Rachel loved her sister. She hoped the baby at Bilah's breast would be as good a man as his mother was a woman. Rachel left Bilah with her son and went to find Jacob. She told her husband that the baby's name was Dan, which means judgment. To the woman who bore him, Dan sounded sweet, but to her, in whose name he was born, it had a bitter ring. The sight of the baby in Bilah's arms day after day shattered Rachel's confidence again. She was only the aunt, the bystander, the barren one, but now she did not rail against the heaven or plague her sisters with temper. She sat, too unhappy to weep, under that acai tree, sacred to Inanan, where the birds gathered at dawn. She went to the Asherah and prostrated herself before the wide-mouthed, grinning goddess, and whispered, "Give me child, or I will die." Jacob saw her suffering and gathered her to him with the greatest tenderness. And after all the years, all the nights, all the miscarriages and broken hopes, Rachel found delight in his arms. I really had no idea why Leah and Bilah sought out Jacob's bed before those days, Rachel said. I had always gone to his bed willingly enough, but mostly out of duty. But after Dan opened Bilah's womb, somehow my own passion finally matched Jacob's, and I understood my sister's willingness to lie with him. And then I was newly jealous for all the years that I had missed of the wild sweetness between lovers. Rachel and Jacob spent many nights together exploring the new heat between them, and Rachel hoped again. Some midwives said that pleasure overheated the seed and killed it, but others claimed that the babies only come when women smile. This was the tale she told Jacob to inspire his caresses. During the last months of Bilah's pregnancy, Zilpah went to Jacob's bed for the first time. She did not offer herself as Bilah had, though she was at least 5 years older, as old as Leah, but had borne 5 live sons by that time. Zilpah knew it would happen someday, and she was resigned to it. But unlike Bilah, Zilpah would never ask. Leah would have to command it. Finally, she did. One night, when I was walking in the light of a full moon, she appeared before me, Zilpah said. At first, I thought I was dreaming. My sister slept as heavily as Laban and never rose at night. Even her own babies had trouble rousing her, but there she was in the stillness. We walked in the bright white light of the Lady Moon, hand in hand, for a long time. And again I wondered if this was really my sister or a ghost, because the woman beside me was silent, whereas Leah always had something to say. Finally she spoke with careful words about the moon. She told me how much she loved the white light, and how she spoke to the moon and called to her by name every month. Leah said the moon was the only face of the goddess that seemed open to her because of the way the moon called forth the filling and emptying of her body. My sister was wise, said Zilpah. She stopped and faced me and took both my hands in hers and asked, Are you ready to swallow the moon at last? What could I say? It was my time. Indeed, it was possible that she had waited too long, and Zilpah half hoped she was too old, at 25, to bear. Age alone was no good augury. Rachel had been barren from her youth despite all her efforts, and Leah, fertile as a watered plain, showed no sign of giving off. The only way to discover the mother of life had in store for Zilpah was for her to go into Jacob and become the least of his wives. The next morning, Leah spoke to Jacob. Bilhah offered to put henna on Zilpah's hands, but she set her mouth and refused. That night, she walked slowly to Jacob's tent, where he lay with her and knew her. Zilpah took no pleasure from Jacob's touch. I did what was required of me, she said, with such a tone that no one dared ask her to say more. She never complained of Jacob's attentions. He did his best to calm her fears, just as he had with the other wives. He called for her many times, trying to win her. He asked her to sing songs of the goddesses and brushed her hair, but nothing he did moved Zilpah. I never understood my sister's eagerness to lie with Jacob, she said. With a weary wave of her long hand, it was duty, like grinding grain, something that wears away at the body but is necessary so that life can go on. Mind you, I was not disappointed, she said. It was nothing I expected to enjoy. Zilpah conceived during Bilhah's pregnancy, and soon after Bilhah's, Dan was born. It truly did appear, though Zilpah had swallowed the moon. On her slender frame, the belly looked huge and perfectly round. Her sisters teased her, but Zilpah only smiled. She was glad to be free of Jacob's attentions, for men did not lie with pregnant women. She gloried in her new body and dreamed wonderful dreams of power and flight. She dreamed of giving birth to a daughter, not a human child, but a changeling of some kind, a spirit woman. Full-grown, full-breasted, she wore nothing but a girdle of string in front and in back. She strode the earth in great steps, and her moon blood made trees grow everywhere she walked. I loved to go to sleep when I was a child, said Zilpah. I traveled so far in my blankets those months. But when her time came, the baby was slow to appear, and Zilpah suffered. Her hips were too narrow, and labor lasted from sunset to sunset for 3 days. Zilpah cried and wailed, sure that her daughter would die or that she would be dead before she saw her girl, her Ashret. For she had chosen her name already and told it to her sisters in case she did not survive. It went hard with Zilpah. On the evening of the 3rd day of her labor, she was all but dead from the pains, which, strong as they were, did not seem to bring the baby any closer to the world. Finally, Ina resorted to an untried potion she had bought from a Canaanite trader. She reached her hand all the way up the stubborn door of Zilpah's womb and rubbed a strong aromatic gum that did its work quickly, wrenching a shriek from Zilpah's throat, which by then was so hoarse from her travail that she sounded less like a woman than an animal caught in the fire. Ina whispered a fragment of an incantation in the name of the ancient goddess of healing. Gula, quicken the delivery. Gula, I appeal to you, miserable and distraught, tortured by pain, your servant, be merciful and hear this prayer. Soon Zilpah was up on the bricks, with Leah standing behind her, supporting the birth of the child conceived in her name. Zilpah had no more tears by the time Ina directed her to push. She was ashen and cold. She was half dead, and there was no strength even to scream when the baby finally came, tearing her flesh front and back. It was not the hoped-for daughter, but a boy, long, thin, and black-haired. Leah hugged her sister and declared her lucky to have such a son and lucky to be alive. Leah named him Gad for good luck and said, "May he bring you the moon and the stars and keep you safe in your old age." But the rejoicing in the red tent was cut short before Zilpah cried out again. The pain had returned. "I am dying. I am dying," she sobbed, weeping for the son who would never know his mother. "He will live as I did," she wailed, the orphan of a concubine haunted by dreams of a cold, dead mother. "Unlucky one," she whimpered. "Unlucky son of an unlucky mother." Ina and Rachel crouched on either side of the despairing mother, seeking the source of this new pain. Ina took Rachel's hand and placed it on Zilpah's belly, showing her a second child in the womb. "Don't give up yet, little mother," Ina said to Zilpah. "You will bear twins tonight." "Didn't you dream of that?" "Not much of a priestess, is she?" She grinned. The second baby came quickly, since Gad had opened the way. He fell out of his mother's womb like a white, ripe fruit, another boy, also dark, but much smaller than the first. But his mother did not see him. A river of blood followed in his wake, and the light in Zilpah's eyes went out. Time and again, Ina and Rachel packed her womb with wool and herbs to staunch the bleeding. They wet her lips with water and strong, honeyed brews. They sang healing hymns and burned incense to keep her spirit from flying out of the tent. But Zilpah lay on the blanket, not dead, but not alive either, for 8 days and more. She was not aware of the circumcision of Gad or her second son whom Leah named Asher, for the goddess Zilpah loved. Leah nursed the boys, and so did Bela and one of the bondswomen. After 10 days, Zilpah moaned and lifted her hands. "I dreamed 2 sons," she croaked. "Is it so?" They brought the babies to her, dark and thriving, and Zilpah laughed. Zilpah's laughter was a rare sound, but the names made her chuckle. Gad and Asher, Luck and the goddess. It sounded like the name of a myth from the old days. She said, "And I was Ninmah, the exalted lady who birthed it all." Zilpah ate and drank and healed, though she could not nurse her sons. Her breasts had gone dry in her illness, but this was a sorrow she could bear. She had 2 sons, both fine and strong, and she did not regret her dream daughter. When they grew to boyhood and left her side, Zilpah sorrowed over the fact that she had no girl to teach. But when she held them in her arms, she tasted only the joy of mothers, the sweetest tears. Ina told her that she would take care not to bear for at least 2 years, but Zilpah had no intentions of going through such pain again. She had given her family 2 sons. She sought out Jacob one morning before he left for the pasture and told him that another pregnancy would surely kill her. She asked that he remember this when he called a wife to his bed, and she never slept with Jacob again. Indeed, Jacob had trembled when he learned that he had gotten twins upon her. He was one of 2 himself, and it had caused him nothing but grief. "Forget that they shared their mother's womb," he ordered. It was so, and not because Jacob commanded it, but because the 2 were so different. Gad, long and lean, with his flutes and drum. Asher, the short, wiry husbandman, with his father's talent with the animals. Leah's next pregnancy also brought twin boys, Naphtali and Issachar. Unlike Zilpah's, though, these twins looked so much alike that as children, Not even their mother could always tell them apart. Only Bila, who could see every leaf on a tree in its own life, was never fooled by those two, who loved each other with a kind of quiet harmony that none of her other brothers knew. Poor Bila, after Dan, all her babies, a boy and 2 girls, died before weaning. But she never let her sorrow poison her heart, and she loved the rest of us instead. Jacob was now a man with 4 wives and 10 sons, and his name was known among the men of the countryside. He was a good father and took his boys with him into the hills as soon as they were able to carry their own water, and he taught them the ways of sheep and goats and the secrets of good pasturage, the habits of long walking, the skills of sling and spear. There, too, far from the tents of their mothers, he told them the terrible stories of his father Isaac. When Jacob and his sons stayed in the far pastures keeping watch where a jackal had been seen, or simply to enjoy the cool night air of a summer month, he would tell his sons the story of how his grandfather Abram bound Isaac hand and foot, and then raised a knife above the boy's throat to give El the sacrifice of his favorite son. El was the only god to whom Jacob bowed down, a jealous, mysterious god, too fearsome, he said, to be fashioned as an idol by human hands, too big to be contained by any place, even a place as big as the sky. El was the god of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. It was Jacob's wish that his sons accept his El as their god too. Jacob was a weaver of words, and he would catch his eager audience in the threads of his tale, telling of the glinting knife, Isaac's eyes wide with fright. The rescue came at the last possible moment, when the knife was at Isaac's throat and a drop of blood trickled down his neck, just like the tears falling from Abram's brimming eyes. But then a fiery spirit stayed the old man's hand and brought a pure white ram to be sacrificed in Isaac's stead. Reuben and Simon, Levi and Judah would stare at their father's arms, stretched out against the starry night, and shudder to think of themselves on the altar. "The God of my fathers is a merciful God," Jacob said, but when Zilpah heard the story from her sons, she said, "What kind of mercy is that, to scare the spit dry in poor Isaac's mouth? Your father's God may be great, but he is cruel." Years later, when his grandsons finally met the boy of the story, by then an old man, they were appalled to hear how Isaac stuttered, still frightened by his father's knife. Jacob's sons adored their father, and his neighbors respected his success, but he was uneasy. Laban owned everything he had attained: the flocks, the bondsmen and their families, the fruit of the garden, the wool for trade. Nor was Jacob alone in his resentment of Laban. Leah and Rachel, Bilhah and Zilpah chafed under the rule of their father, who seemed to grow more crude and arrogant as the years passed. He treated his own daughters like slaves and cuffed their sons. He profited from the labor of their looms without a word of thanks. He leered at the bondswomen and took their beer at a bribe against his lust. He mistreated Rudy every day. 4 sisters spoke of these things in the red tent, which they always entered a day before the rest of the women in the camp. Perhaps their early years together, when they were the only women in the camp, created a habit in their bodies that brought on the flow of blood some hours before the bondswomen. Or perhaps it was simply the need of their hearts to spend a day among themselves. In any event, the bondswomen did not complain, nor was it their place to say anything. Besides, Jacob's wives would always greet them with sweets, as they entered to celebrate the new moon and the rest on the straw. Rudy said nothing, but her blackened eyes and her bruises reproached them. No older than Leah, Rudy had grown haggard in their midst. After the birth of her sons, Laban had treated her well. The tight-fisted goat had even brought her bangles to brighten her wrists and ankles. But then she gave off bearing, and he began to hit her and call her names, so ugly my mothers would not repeat them to me. Rudy's shoulders stooped with despair, and several of her teeth were broken from the force of Laban's fists. Even so, he continued to use her body for his own pleasure, a thought that made my mothers shudder. For all their pity, Jacob's wives did not embrace Rudy. She was the mother of their sons' rivals, their material enemy. The bondswomen saw how the sisters kept themselves apart from her, and they followed suit. Even her own sons laughed at her and treated her like a dog. Rudy, already alone, kept to herself. She became such a ragged, battered misery to look at that no one saw her. When she came to Rachel, desperate for help, she seemed more a ghost than a woman. "Lady, I beg you, give me the herbs to cast out the baby I carry," she whispered in a cold, flat hiss. "I would rather die than give him another son, and if it is a girl, I will drown her before she is old enough to suffer at his hands." "Help me for the sake of my husband's sons," said Rudy in a voice from the other side of the grave. "I know you will not do it for me. You hate me, all of you." Rachel brought Rudy's words to her sisters, who listened in silence and were ashamed. "Do you know how to do that?" asked Leah. Rachel waved a hand, dismissing the question as beneath consideration. It was not a difficult matter, especially since Rudy was in the first month. Bilah's eyes blazed. "We are no better than he is to have let her suffer alone, to have given her no comfort to help." Zilpah turned to Rachel and asked, "When will you do it?" "We must wait for the next new moon, when all the women come to us," Rachel answered. "Laban is too stupid to suspect anything. I don't think even the subtlest among them realizes what we know and do among ourselves, but it is better to be careful." The sisters did not change in their apparent treatment of Rudy. They did not speak to her or show her any special kindness. But at night, when Laban snored, one of the four would find her, huddled on her filthy blanket in a far corner of the tent, and feed her broth or honeyed bread. Zilpah took on Rudy's suffering as her own. She could not bear the emptiness in her eyes or the despair that hung about her like a fog from the world of the dead. She took to visiting her every night to whisper words of encouragement into Rudy's ears, but she only lay there, deaf to any hope. Finally, the moon waned and all the women entered the red tent. Leah stood before the bondswomen and lied with pure heart. "Rudy is unwell. Her courses are overdue, but her belly is hot and we fear a miscarriage tonight. Rachel will do everything she can with herbs and incantations to save the child. Let us care for our sister Rudy." But within a few minutes, it was clear to most of them that Rachel's ministration were intended not to save the baby, but to cast it out. They watched from the far side of the red tent, where cakes and wine sat untouched, as Rachel mixed a black herbal brew, which Rudy drank in silence. She lay still, her eyes closed. Zilpah muttered the names of Anath and the healer and the ancient Gula who attends women at childbirth, while Rachel whispered words of praise to Rudy, whose courage unfolded as the night wore on. When the herbs began to work, causing great riping cramps, Rudy made no sound. When the blood began to flow, clotted and dark, Rudy's lips did not part. As the hours passed, the blood ran and did not stop, and she said nothing. Rachel packed Rudy's wound with wool many times until finally it was over. No one knew what happened that night. No child blurted the secret, because none of the women ever spoke of it, not a word, until Zilpah told me the story. By then it was nothing but an echo from the grave. My mother told me that after the birth of her twin sons, she decided to finish with childbearing. Her breasts were those of an old woman, her belly was slack, and her back ached every morning. The thought of another pregnancy filled her with dread, and so she took to drinking fennel to keep Jacob's seed from taking root again. But when it happened that the supply of seeds ran low while Ina was far away in the north, months passed and still she did not return with her pouches of herbs. Leah tried an old remedy, soaking a lock of wool in an old olive oil and placing it at the mouth of her womb before lying with Jacob. But her efforts failed, and for the first time the knowledge of life within her brought her low. Leah did not wish to take this trouble to Rachel, whose hunger for her own baby had not diminished. The fertile wife had tried to spare her barren sister's feelings by keeping a respectful distance from her. They divided the duties of the chief wife. Leah had charge of the weaving and cooking, the garden, and the children. Rachel, still lovely and slim-waisted, served her husband and waited upon traders who came to the camp. She looked after Jacob's needs, and her skills as a healer growing, saw to the pains and illnesses of men, women, and even beasts. Births and the new moon brought the two women together inside the red tent, but Leah slept facing the western wall while Rachel hugged the east, and they spoke to each other only by way of their sisters, Leah through Zilpah, Rachel through Bilhah. Now Leah had no choice. Ina had not returned, and Rachel was the only one who knew the herbs, the prayers, the proper massage. There was no one else to ask. As Rachel left to attend a birth in the nearby camp, Leah made some excuse about fetching water and rushed her steps until she was at Rachel's side. Leah's cheeks burned as she cast her eyes downward as she asked her sister to help her, and as she had helped Rudy. Rachel surprised her with the gentleness of her answer. "Do not do away with your daughter," she said. "You are carrying a girl." "Then she will die," Leah answered, thinking of Rachel's miscarriages. Ina had pronounced them all girls, and even if she lived, she will not know her mother, because I am nearly dead from bearing. But Rachel argued for all of her sisters who had long saved their treasures for a daughter. We will do everything for you as you carry the girl, Leah," she said, using her sister's name for the first time in either woman's memory. "Please," she asked, "do as I say before I tell Zilpah," Rachel threatened mischievously. "She will make your life a misery of scorned goddesses if she discovers your plans." Leah laughed and relented, for her wish for a daughter was still strong. "While I slept in my mother's womb, I appeared to her, to each of my aunties, in vivid dreams. Bilhah dreamed of me one night while she lay in Jacob's arms. I saw you in a white gown of fine linen, covered with a long vest of blue and green beads. Your hair was braided, and you carried a fine basket through a pasture greener than any I've ever seen. You walked among queens, but you were alone. Rachel dreamed of my birth. You appeared at your mother's womb, with your eyes open and your mouth full of perfect little teeth. You spoke as you slithered out from between her legs, saying, 'Hello, mothers, I am here at last. Is there nothing to eat?' That made us laugh. There were hundreds of women attending your birth, some of them dressed in outlandish clothing, shocking colors, shorn heads. We all laughed and laughed. I woke in the middle of the night laughing. My mother, Leah, said that she dreamed of me every night. You and I whispered to each other like old friends. You were very wise, telling me to eat, to calm my upset stomach, how to settle a quarrel between Reuben and Simon. I told you all, Jacob, your father, and about your aunties. You told me about the other side of the universe, where darkness and light are not separated. You were such good company. I hated to wake up. One thing bothered me about those dreams, said my mother. I could never see your face. You were always behind me, just beyond my left shoulder, and every time I turned to catch a glimpse of you, you disappeared. Zilpah's dream was not filled with laughter or companionship. She said she saw me weeping, a river of blood that gave rise to flat green monsters that opened mouths filled with rows of sharp teeth. Even so, you were unafraid, said Zilpah. You walked upon their backs and tamed their ugliness and disappeared into the sun. I was born during a full moon in a springtime remembered for a plenitude of lambs. Zilpah stood on my mother's left side while Bela supported her on the right. Ina was there to be on hand for the celebration and to catch the afterbirth in her ancient bucket, but Leah had asked Rachel to be midwife and catch me. It was an easy birth. After all the boys before me, I came quickly and as painlessly as birth can be. I was big as Judah, who had been the biggest. Ina pronounced me Leah's daughter in a voice full of satisfaction. As with all of her babies, my mother looked into my eyes first and smiled to see that they were both brown, like Jacob's and those of all of her sons. After Rachel wiped me clean, she handed me to Zilpah, who embraced me, and then to Bela, who kissed me as well. I took my mother's breast with an eager mouth, and all the women of the camp clapped their hands for my mother and for me. Bela fed my mother honeyed milk and cake. She washed Leah's hair with perfumed water, and she massaged her feet. While Leah slept, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bela took me out into the moonlight and put henna on my feet and hands, as though I were a bride. They spoke 100 blessings around me, north, south, east, and west, to protect me against Lamashtu and the other baby-stealing demons. They gave me 1,000 kisses. In the morning, my mother began to count out 2 moon cycles in the red tent. After the birth of a boy, mothers rested from one moon to the next, but the birth of a birth giver required a longer period of separation from the world of men. The 2nd month was such a delight, my mother told me. My sisters treated us both like queens. You were never left lying upon a blanket for a moment. There were always arms to hold you, cuddle you, embrace you. We oiled your skin morning and night. We sang songs into your ears, but we did not coo or babble. We spoke to you with all our words as though you were a grown sister and not a baby girl. And before you were a year old, you answered us without a trace of your baby's lisp. As I was passed from mother to one aunt after another, they debated my name. This conversation never ceased, and each woman argued for a favorite she had long hoped to give a daughter of her womb. Bela offered Adonani in memory of my grandmother, Ada, who had loved them all. She led a long session of sighing and remembering Ada, who would have been so delighted by all of her grandchildren. But Zilpah worried that such a name would confuse the demons, who might think Ada had escaped from the underworld and come after me. Zilpah liked the name Ishara, which gave homage to the goddess and was easy to rhyme. She had plans for many songs in my honor, but Bila didn't like the sound of it. It sounds like a sneeze, she said. Rachel suggested Bintresh, a Hittite name she had heard from a trader's wife. It sounds like music, she said. Leah listened to them all, and when her sisters got too heated in their arguments about her daughter, threatened to call me Lilu, a name they all hated. In the second full moon after my birth, Leah rejoined her husband and told Jacob my name. She told me that I picked it myself. During the 60 days, I whispered every name my sisters suggested into your little ear. Every name I had ever heard, and even some I invented myself. But when I said Dina, you let the nipple fall off your mouth and looked up at me. So you are Dina, my last-born, my daughter, my memory. Joseph was conceived in the following days following my birth. Rachel had gone to Jacob with the news that he finally sired a healthy girl. Her eyes shone as she told him, and Jacob smiled to see how his barren wife took pleasure in Leah's baby. That night, after they had enjoyed each other in a gentle fashion of familiar couples, Rachel dreamed of her first son and woke up smiling. She told no one when her moon blood failed to come. The many false starts and early losses haunted her, and she guarded her secret closely. She went to the red tent as the new moon and changed the straw as though she had soiled it. She was so slender that the slight thickening of her waist went unnoticed by everyone but Bila, who kept her own counsel. At the 4th month, Rachel went to Ina, who told her that the signs looked good for this boy, and Rachel began to hope. She showed her swelling belly to her sisters, who danced in circles around her. She put Jacob's hand on the hillock of her womb. The father of 10 sons wept. Rachel grew sway-backed. Her little breast grew full and painful. Her perfect ankles swelled. But she found nothing but delight in the complaints of breeding women. She began to sing as she tended the cooking fires and took up her spindle. Her family was surprised at the sweetness of her voice, which they had never heard raised in song. Jacob slept with Rachel every night of her pregnancy, a shocking breach of manners and incitement to demons. But he would not listen to warning, and Rachel basked in his attentions as she grew large. In her 8th month, Rachel began to sicken. Her skin paled and her hair fell out. She could barely stand without falling into a faint. Fear swallowed her hope, and she called for Ina, who prescribed strong broths made from the bones of rams and bulls. She told Rachel to rest and came to visit her friend as often as she could. Ina came to deliver Rachel. The baby's feet were down, and there was bleeding long before he appeared. Ina's efforts to turn the child caused Rachel terrible pain, and she cried out so pitifully that all of the children of the camp burst into tears at the sounds. Jacob sat on the bama, staring at the face of the goddess, wondering whether he ought to make some sort of offering to her, even though he had promised to worship his father's God only. He tore at the grass and held his head until he could stand the sounds of her screams no longer, and he went off to the high pasture until Rachel was delivered. It was 2 days before Reuben was sent to bring him back, 2 terrible days in which Leah and Zilpah and Bila each bade Rachel goodbye. It seemed so certain that she would die. But Ina did not give up. She gave Rachel every herb and every medicine in her pouches. She tried combinations that no herb weaver had used. She muttered secret prayers though she was not initiated into the mysteries of the magic world and incantations. Rachel did not give up, but fought for her heart's desire, denied for 15 years. She battled like an animal, her eyes rolling, sweat pouring from her. Even after 3 days and 3 nights, she did not call for death or to release her from the torment. She was mighty to behold, said Zilpa. Finally, Ina got the baby to turn, but the effort seemed to break something within Rachel, whose body was seized by a shudder that would not let go. Her eyes rolled up in her head and her neck tightened so that she faced backwards. It was as though demons had taken possession of her body. Even Ina gasped. Then it was over. Rachel's body had released from death's grasp, and the baby's head appeared, and Rachel found the last of her strength to push him out. He was small, with a big thatch of hair, a baby like all babies, wrinkled, homely, and perfect. Best of all, he was Rachel's. The tent fell silent as every woman wept grateful tears. Without a word, Ina cut the cord, and Bila called the afterbirth. Leah cleaned Rachel, and Zilpa washed the baby. They sighed and wiped their eyes. Rachel would live to see her baby grow. Rachel recovered slowly, but she could not give suck. 3 days after Joseph's birth, her breast grew hard and hot. Warm compresses eased her pain, but the milk dried up. Leah, who was nursing me at the time, took Joseph to her breast as well. Rachel's old anger at Leah flared at that, but it vanished when she discovered that Joseph was a fretful baby who screamed and squirmed until he lay in his own mother's arms. I hope you're enjoying the story. Join us tomorrow for part 2, chapter 4. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. Happy sleeping.